According to Singapore's latest census released today, from 2010 to 2020, our total population grew by around 1.1% each year, the slowest rate since independence. Comprising Singaporeans and PRs, the resident population stands at 5.686 million in 2020. While among the key findings, Singapore's population is still aging. If you hone in on the last set of data here, those aged 65 years and older formed 15.2% of the population in 2020, a marked rise from 9% back in 2010. The proportion of single people also rose, and this is happening across all age groups, with the sharpest increase among younger Singaporeans 25 to 34 years old. The proportion of married residents dropped slightly over the past decade by 0.6 percentage points. And for those who are married, they're having fewer children. The average number of children born dropped from 2.02 per woman in 2010 to 1.76 in 2020. Reasons for this are complex. Some reasons cited over the years range from couples marrying later and having fewer children to the financial burden and educational stresses of raising kids. Well, here to help us understand why these figures matter is senior political correspondent for the Straits Times, Grace Ho. So Grace, from 2010 to 2020, Singapore had its slowest population growth. Those 65 years old and above make up the biggest demographic of the resident population. Plus, more are staying single and married couples are having fewer babies. So how worrying are these trajectories, and what are the implications for Singapore in the long term?
This is something which has been going on for some time now. There were similar trends in the previous census, which was taken for the period from 2000 to 2010. Overall, if you have a graying population with fewer babies and fewer young Singaporeans, it means that there is a greater tax as well as economic burden on those who are of working age. This could be in the form of subsidies for medical and social services, or maybe cash transfers from family members to make up for shortfalls in the elderly's CPF savings. But I think generally the unique point about Singapore is that old age support is financed through an individual's own savings in CPF rather than through pensions, which are taxpayer financed. So the direct taxation burden is still generally lower in Singapore than some other countries. The second implication is that more people are needed for caregiving, right? Whether it's in terms of paid help like domestic helpers and nurses or family members. And if people drop out of the workforce to take care of their elderly, then this could affect the labor that's available for the Singapore workforce. But it's not all doom and gloom, in the sense that over the last decade, the labor force participation of older Singaporeans has actually nearly doubled. So you have older people who are today healthier and they live longer than their counterparts in the past. I think the crucial thing is to encourage them to take on new job opportunities. For example, also by extending the retirement and re-employment ages. And we can also deploy older people as caregivers and volunteers in the community. So there's definitely room for them to do more. As for implications on productivity, theoretically speaking, the productivity levels, for everybody across their lifespan increases up to a certain age and then it goes down. So, some will say that, okay, if you have older people in the workforce, there'll be lower productivity levels. But that's if you look at it in a traditional paradigm, right? So if you have advances in education and lifelong learning, might we not in fact see improvements in labor force productivity? But what this means is that there will need to be serious efforts to maybe automate certain tasks or adapt the job roles so that the constraints and the skills of older workers can be taken into account. So it's all about extending the period of time until that person's productivity really starts to fall very sharply.
Right. Well, great points there to underscore the importance of understanding these population data. Well, Grace, let's focus now on the education aspect. The census also found that people here are better educated. Now, residents across different age and ethnic groups attained higher educational qualifications over the past decade. So what would that mean for white and blue collar work? Does it mean that, more white collar jobs need to be created? And at the same time, how do we find people to fill blue collar positions?
Yeah, so we've all seen what's happened during COVID-19 with the construction delays, manpower shortages. The reality is that some level of immigration and foreign labor in Singapore is still needed, especially for blue collar positions, which Singaporeans may not want to take on. But even within this group, some companies have given the feedback that certain nationalities are now harder to attract to Singapore because conditions back home for them have improved. They can draw a decent salary elsewhere. So for blue collar workers too, we have to improve hygiene factors like work safety, pay, living and transport conditions. As for white collar jobs, there's been a lot of talk about how we need to pivot to new growth sectors after COVID-19. So much has been done to equip Singaporeans with new skill sets to thrive in this new age. I think the bigger concern now is not just whether you have a university degree to take on white collar jobs, but whether you have the right skills needed. So there has been a perceptible shift in thinking about what constitutes a good education. In other words, just because you went to a fancy university doesn't guarantee that you will always have a good job. So at a deeper level, we have to reevaluate what we consider as important, impactful, and essential occupations and broaden our definition of success. I think the bottom line is that as long as you can keep the economy growing, there will be that capacity to absorb the labor. And then on the skill side, to also make sure that workers have what it takes to succeed in the workforce.
Right, of course. Well, moving on to religious affiliation, while Singapore remains religiously diverse, there are growing numbers of Singaporeans who cite no religious affiliation, 20% in 2020 compared with 17% back in 2010. What were the interesting points in this particular area for you, Grace?
Yeah, so this proportion has actually been going up from 17% in 2010 and then 15% in the year 2000. And the increase has taken place across all age groups and most types of educational qualifications. Although the prevalence is higher among the more educated, younger Singaporeans and Chinese Singaporeans. In fact, more than 1/4 of Chinese residents had no religious affiliation last year, compared to 0.4% of Malays and 2.2% of Indians. We're not quite sure the reasons for the specifics, the racial breakdown yet, but we have to stress here that just because you don't have a religious affiliation doesn't mean that you're an atheist. It may just mean that you don't identify with any particular religion at this point in time. Maybe Singaporeans are taking time to explore different religions and to be firm, when they finally land on one. But what is important is that we maintain a secular approach to governing Singapore. Given that the proportions among the various religions, as well as those without a religion, seems to be evolving with time. And what that means from a policy standpoint is that you don't prefer one religion over another, or you don't prefer religion over non-religion. And it's also important that minority faiths have their identities secure in Singapore, and that we do our best to ensure that the freedom of religious belief is sufficiently protected.
Well, the ethnic composition of the population has remained stable, with 74.3% Chinese, 13.5% Malays and 9% Indians. What sort of bearing does race-based data have on how we address race issues in Singapore, especially with recent cases of racism and xenophobia coming to the fore?
Yeah, so some have pointed out that when we discuss race-based data, this tends to sort of racialize and magnify some of the differences between your ethnic groups. If you take education, for example, the proportion of university graduates last year was more than 30% for Chinese, close to 11% for Malays, and about 41% for Indians. So, but if you take a step back and you look at it objectively, tracking such data is relevant and it's done with the best of intentions to ensure that no group is left behind and that we can identify where the pain points are. So, for example, if you have a problem and you have a sense of how many people are involved, what's the size of the problem, then you can start to drill down to root causes. In cases where the issue is specific to certain ethnic groups, then you can also rope in their self-help groups or even religious groups to address these issues at a very targeted or community level. The whole point of the race-based data really is to see if there are any gaps and to try and bridge those gaps. There are no easy answers because you have to balance that desire to solve an issue with all the sensitivities that come with it. And it's not likely that Singapore will reach a post-racial stage anytime soon, or that we can ignore differences of race, religion, or language. More fundamentally, it's really for a reminder for everyone to make a conscious effort to prevent discussions on these issues from descending into finger pointing or divisiveness.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the insight, Grace. I've been speaking with Grace Ho, Senior Political Correspondent for the Straits Times. You can read all about the census key findings at straitstimes.com and look out for a second set of data which will be released on Friday.